Here is Monteverde Love Red, and this red is pure like my love. This is a very bright, basic red, like my love. This is great, like my last name. This gives a fairly consistent tone as paper changes, though in the side by side, you can see the slightest of tone shifts. I'm not going to make a to-do out of it. It's just the slightest of shifts. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, this performs as good with no real aggression issues, making this a good ink for student note takers. Now, I want this, a bottle of it, but just to grade papers. Then I can say that it is graded with love. It is love that takes all those points away. So here's your F.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M120. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
This would be very much a basic red if it wasn't more interesting in the way that it is. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade, and it shades fairly regularly. You can choose just about any word and see where shading is. Look at subset. Subset goes from nice mid-tones to darker, back to mids, to dark, to mids, to dark again at the end. Even in words where you get less shading, like namely on the third line, you see that NA is slightly darker than the ME, and the LY are the darkest letters at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Monteverde makes more than just one ink, so let's take a look at a few other inks from Monteverde.
Here is Monteverde Blue Black. Here is Monteverde Smoke Noir. Here is Monteverde Capri Blue. Here is Monteverde Document Black.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter Notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, barely shades. There is a little bit you can find if you look into what's happening. Look it into. It's the downstroke and cross of the T, very small cross of the T, but the downstroke of the T that you see, it does get darker. But mostly what we get to see is a uniform tone in the writing. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here the tone is just a little bit lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine, likely a result of the tone of the paper, meaning the ink itself is slightly translucent. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, does shade fairly well. Look at make on the second line compared to worse on the first line. There's worse shading in worse on the first line. Make on the second line starts lighter with the MA, gets very dark with the KE at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we have no problem with bleeding or ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. There is shading that you can spot in this, but it's not huge. It's a whole lot less shading than we had on the Clairfontaine. More noticeable is it stands out against the quad rule without any kind of a problem. Now, I don't know that I do full pages of red, but that's all me thing. As a second color, I think this is great for use on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more red inks.
Here is Ackerman Dutch Masters, their number 12. Here is Dietramentis Dante Alighieri Ruby Red. Here is Organic Studios Oscars Copper. Here is Sailor Licorsis Spider Lily.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here the tone is just a little bit lighter and flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine, really coming more across as a basic red most of the time. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade. Take a look at elements on the second line where the ELE is a little bit darker than the MEN, and the TS at the end does get quite a bit darker. This is a nice looking ink on this paper that stands out against the quad rule without any kind of problem. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page. Here is Platinum Blue Black. Here is Diatramentis Silver Gray. Here is Krishna Winter. Here is KWZ Warsaw Dream. The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here the tone is very close to the tone we got on the Clairfontaine, ever so slightly lighter, but incredibly close. It's not feathering. It is getting some spread, less spread than we would normally see on copy paper, and it is shading. Take a look at similarly, where the semi in the beginning is a little bit lighter, generally speaking, in tone. The LA get quite a bit darker. The R lightens a little bit, and the LY at the end do get darker again. I think this looks very nice on this paper and might be a really good match for it. Looking at the back of the page, we have no problem for ghosting. There is a little bit of deeper into the paper. I don't think this deeper into the paper would stop most people from writing back here. This is a good match with copy paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The wet fine of the Pelikan M120 gives a passionate red that does shade and looks good on the page. Off camera, I tried this in a dry stub. It shaded more, but gave a lighter red that no longer had the love. But I had and not even a like for this ink, just like. I go for a wet pen of any nib size to get those powerful emotions onto the page with spicing it up a little bit with some shading.